It's not fair. Any one of you that have children will understand that statement. Fair or fairness is absolutely fundamental to understand. It is very important and will shape the way you behave inside the community that is your company or your business unit. In particular, the staff you look after will look to you for fairness. Trust is the foundation of everything. If you don't have trust, you don't really have anything. Your staff aren't going to stay with you, and they certainly aren't going to work the way you want to be engaged. You need trust. Fairness is an underpinning, it's a building block for trust. We all know this, and yet as soon as we encounter some certain situations, it goes out the window. It's situations like salary negotiation, taking care of staff that have been behaving badly or performing badly, coaching sometimes, anything where you feel a little bit uncomfortable maybe. Shame, which we know as the enemy of trust and vulnerability in our relationships, and therefore our community, that is our staff, is also pivotal in that fundamental breaking down of fairness. Without fairness, you won't have trust, and I think we all want to be fair. It's the shame thing that tends to pop it out the window. It's when we start to feel a little bit uncomfortable, and it's like that old saying, it only matters when it's difficult. For some impractical and rather bizarre reason, we believe that in order to be good managers, we should never be making decisions that are in conflict or difficult for our staff. That everything should be lovely and airy-fairy, and the world just doesn't work that way. But what happens is, as soon as we get ourselves into those situations, shame starts to raise its ugly head. We feel a little bit uncomfortable. Socially we shouldn't be having this difficult conversation, perhaps. And I often think we're the ones that are making it difficult. But anyway, because of that, we start to put on our public face. We start to tatamai the whole thing. And by God, that's when your troubles start. If you don't understand the term tatamai, by the way, you should see my video on that, because it's really quite important. It puts a bit of a language around the public face, the put on, the way we hide our personal shame, and that really impacts the way we manage. And fairness, I think, is inherent in all of us. We all want to be fair, and we all want to see fairness presented to us. Where it falls apart is where the whole tatamai and shame thing comes into it. The reason that it's the stupidest thing we do when it all falls apart because of our shame is partly human behaviour, but also because it hinges on fairness. The way you're judged by your staff has nothing to do with how you behave. Now, I know that sounds pretty radical, and it's not entirely true. It has a little bit to do with how you behave, but it has far more to do with how fair was your behaviour in the circumstances. That is really the bottom line. And if you think about it, that's the bottom line for you. Why shouldn't it be the bottom line for everybody else? Strangely, it is. So when we run off from these difficult conversations and we close down and we start to hide our shame and we put tatamai on and we do all this stuff, we really are being the opposite of what we should be. Fairness is something we really need to understand. It really goes to the core of who we are. Very, very early on in life, and those of you that are parents will know this, children start to complain, "Mum, that's not fair." It's almost like it's the first balance of the equation. Is it fair? And believe me, your staff, your managers and everybody else will accept almost anything if they deem it to be fair. And if they don't, you have a much bigger problem. And there are a few occasions where you strike that, where people are sort of outside that bounds of normal social behaviour. But most people aren't. Most people instead will deem it to be unfair, and then you're in trouble. Now, fairness is about trust, and as soon as the trust is eroded, you're in trouble. So if you have a negotiation or a meeting about salaries and you're closed, and it's apparent that you're closed and you're not being fully open and honest with your staff, and there's this sort of barrier that goes up that wasn't there before, they're going to start to think, I don't know if I trust what's being told to me here. I don't know if I trust the agenda, and I'm not sure if this is fair, to be fair. So here's a key part that we need to know. Fairness is rooted in truth, not in our perception of what should be fair, although our social balance, our social expectation comes into it, but it's actually underpinned by the truth. We tend to believe if these facts are true, then it is or isn't fair. It's that simple. Where we get into trouble is where the facts aren't known. And so if the facts aren't known, it's open for reinterpretation or guesswork on those facts. And trust me, if you're on the other side of a difficult conversation, you are going to start to re-engineer some of those facts, and you'll come to the conclusion that it's not fair. So I'll tell you what I do, and I'll use a salary negotiation as an example, and it might give you an idea of how this works and how you can avoid the whole tatamai, closed off, shame, unfair appreciation coming out of a lack of trust. So when it comes to a salary negotiation, I would always like to give my staff as much as they're worth, and that's quite honest, and I think most managers actually would. But we're constrained. We have constraints about what's practical, how much they actually are worth in the market, the balance of profitability and cost in the business, and there's a whole lot of formulas that go into that, and we're all under that rule. So it's not a case of I like you or I don't like you, it's a case of whether you perform or not, and where the limits are for that. Where's the bang for the buck? Or it should be, for sure. Or there is going to be a problem with fairness. So when I sit down for a salary negotiation, I take all of my staff through that. I paint out the picture for them of all of the metrics that I am juggling and how I need to get that to work, including, by the way, their performance in their role in comparison to their peers, because that's part of the equation. That's one of the reasons why companies have salary bounds. It gives a framework that everybody can work to and you can hire to and things like that. But it also gives you a framework, a band in which you can scale people and go performance, productivity, output versus what they're being paid. And that's an open conversation as well. So I sit them down and I go through all of this. I paint out the whole picture so they understand where I'm at and what constraints I'm under. And I'm even very honest, because you have to be, and you should be, about where they fit in that and how they rank against their peers and where they could perhaps improve. But in a salary negotiation, it's actually where they are at the moment. So laying all that out, I then go, here's where you're at, and here's the potential of where you could go to from a salary point of view. What do you think you're worth? What do you think you should get as a salary? Quite honestly. Don't pitch me some random idea. Just look at it from my point of view with these parameters and give me an idea of what you think is a fair salary. Now a really interesting thing happens. A very interesting thing happens. And you'll be very surprised if you haven't ever taken this approach. If you have never taken this approach before. Normally, they come back with a figure for their own salary rise, if there is one to be had, that's lower than what I would have. And we actually then become a positive discussion point. Why did you think it should be that low? I thought you were perhaps worth about this. And we can go back and forth. And generally speaking, we end up with a staff member who's happy with their salary. Happy with their salary review because they got what they thought was fair or more than what they thought was fair. And the strange thing is they aim low because they see it as fair. They see all the criteria and they get there. They get to fair. Where the problem comes about is when it's not clear. The facts aren't clear. I have the whole tatamai face on and they are thinking, that's not right. I don't feel right. It doesn't feel fair. Well, a strange thing happens then too, and they start to rewrite the facts. They start to generate their own set of circumstances which will produce the outcome that they want. They deem it all to be unfair and they'll pitch up here unrealistically, and you'll end up in this tussle of we'll get back to where we're at. And part of the reason they do that, and you know because you'll do this as well, is if I start way out here, they'll pull me back to what's acceptable. Give them the facts, make it feel fair, make it in reality be fair, and they will set their own boundaries the same as you would in the same ballpark. And you can both come out of it feeling like, actually, that was a trusting conversation, not a manipulating conversation on either end. It wasn't a conflict. It wasn't a hard negotiation. It was a really great conversation. Now, non-confrontational, very open and honest conversations with our staff actually feel quite difficult and confrontational internally for new managers. Feel really uncomfortable about it because they know that if they paint out the picture, they know in their minds, if they paint out the picture, those boundaries will get pulled apart and stretched. But in truth, that's not what happens. In truth, what happens is there might be a few challenges of, is that real? But once a person on the other side thinks, actually that is real, they'll play in that ballpark. And it's empowering. And it shouldn't be scary. Trust me, you create a much bigger, more scary situation when you deal with your staff from a closed-off position. And trust goes out the door, fairness goes out the door, and we've got a serious problem with that relationship with our staff. Now, a very bizarre thing happens if you're really fair and honest and clear and open with your staff. You can have really quite difficult conversations from a calm, relaxed position. You don't have to get into an argument because it's just, this is the way it is. And unfortunately, that's the way it has to be because of X, Y, Z, the facts. And even if that's a very difficult conversation, your guy who's continually arriving late at work, or underperforming, or the lazy guy in the team, or whatever it might be, you can have a real honest conversation, and they might not like what they're hearing, but they'll gauge it on whether it's fair. And if it is fair, they'll begrudgingly accept that you are going to do what you said you were going to do, whether they like it or not. More importantly, though, there's an even bigger effect, much bigger effect. You'll notice that a strange thing happens in the culture of your company, of the rest of your staff. We often deal with difficult staff matters by trying to keep them private. Now, there's a point where it is the privacy of the staff member you're dealing with, and that has to be respected. But word gets out. People notice that a staff member comes back to his desk or office and he's very unhappy after a meeting. That conversation goes around. The difference will be is if that conversation is open, and if you're behaving open and, more importantly, remember that whole judgment, fairly to that person, staff members will judge your behavior in a completely different manner than what you might expect. They are just as human as the rest of us. They grew up as little kids going, "Mum, it's not fair." They recognize when it's not fair, and they recognize when it is. Now, if a staff member is behaving particularly badly and you've reprimanded them fairly, they'll be judged as the ones who are behaving unfairly in the situation. And the fact that they've been punished or dismissed or whatever it might be, the fact that they've been dealt with appropriately from a manager's point of view won't become a them and an us. It'll become a, he should have known better. That's not the way you behave to your manager. You get those sorts of conversations. Fairness is the key, not only to dealing on a one-to-one basis, but the community's judgment of how you're dealing with difficult situations. And fairness comes out of honesty, trust, and your team's ability to judge, was that fair? Now, when I was a fairly new manager, I had a number of situations where I had staff that weren't behaving very well at all and eventually had to be counselled and removed from the employment of the company. That's a really awkward thing to do, and you feel very uncomfortable, especially as a new manager. I was particularly concerned as I was trying to build a culture how the company actually felt about that, how my reportees really felt about that. Were they all wary of me? Was I now something to be scared of a little bit? And that's not where I wanted to be. So I asked one of the older members of staff, who was a bit more astute, one of the people who reported to me, how he thought everybody was feeling about that. And the response I got surprised me and taught me quite a lot in that one incident. The response was, "Wow, no, why would we be worried? He clearly had been given too many chances anyway. We're actually more concerned that you were being too soft and he was going to be allowed to stick around forever because we were having to pick up the slack. It just wasn't fair. if you really want to know, we think perhaps you should have acted a bit sooner. That really floored me. But it all comes back to that sense of fairness. They thought I was being too fair and perhaps even being taken advantage of. Fairness really is the bottom line when it comes to trust in a culture. Behave with your staff from the right side of fair. Now that doesn't mean soft or easygoing or not demanding. It just means fair. And the circumstances all dictate fairness. If you're in the army training to be a SEAL or something like that, you'd expect to be treated really hard and have massive demands placed upon you, but you would see it as fair. If you're just having a casual day and working really quietly and there's no drama around, you wouldn't accept the same sort of behaviour. But those same people would expect them to be revved up quite a lot if they're not moving fast enough and there's a crisis. Treat your staff from the right side of fair and you'll go a fair way towards gaining their trust.